The golden light of Ashwood's autumn was supposed to mean harvest and celebration. But for Maggie, it tasted like cold iron. She stood in the flooded ruins of her diner's back room, her boots sinking into oily sludge, staring at the heavy steel door she'd just ripped from its hiding place in the foundation. Inside the safe sat a single leather book, a ledger that felt heavier than the brick and mortar of the town itself. As she brushed the grime from its cover, the rhythmic metallic screech of a black SUV's tires echoed from the street, and a shadow cut across the diner window, lingering just long enough to tell her she wasn't alone. One minute, she was a grieving widow trying to fix a pipe. The next, she was clutching a secret that made her husband's ghost feel like a stranger. Outside, the New Horizon banners snapped in the wind like whip cracks, and the festive music from the square sounded suddenly like a funeral march. Maggie felt the weight of the ledger against her chest, a collection of codes and red ink that proved the town's prosperity was built on a graveyard of stolen lives. As the SUV lurched forward and vanished into the gray twilight without a license plate, she realized the neighbors who had smiled at her for years were no longer her friends. They were the guardians of a lie she had just accidentally unburied. Maggie O'Connell gripped the damp rag, her knuckles white as she drove it across the sticky surface of the bar counter. The rhythmic motion left behind a glistening trail of moisture and the sharp, medicinal sting of bleach that bit at her nostrils. Outside, through the wide, grease-streaked panoramic window of the diner, the Ashwood air shimmered with the frantic energy of a town on the brink of a transformation. Men in neon orange safety vests swarmed the central square like industrious hornets. Above them, the jagged edges of a massive vinyl banner, New Horizon, snapped and popped in the biting wind. Maggie paused, her hand coming to a rest on the cool laminate, watching as workers strained against thick nylon ropes to secure the smiling, airbrushed faces of politicians over the cobblestones. The gold paint on the blocky letters caught the low, autumnal sun, throwing harsh, metallic glints back into the diner. Behind her, the coffee urn on the stove emitted a sharp, staccato whistle, a plume of white steam ghosting into the air. Across the street, a heavy sledgehammer met a wooden post, with a dull, bone-deep thud, driving another stake into the skeleton of the festival stage. The cemetery was a different world, one where the frantic pulse of the New Horizon project couldn't reach. Cold granite bit into Maggie's fingertips as she brushed a light dusting of dry pine needles from James's headstone. The silence of the Ashwood graveyard felt heavy, broken only by the distant, mocking caw of a crow and the brittle crunch of frozen grass beneath her boots. She stared at the carved letters. James Patrick O'Connell, devoted husband and honest servant of the city. A sharp gust of wind whipped across the hill, stinging her eyes until they watered. In the blur of the gray afternoon, she saw James again. Not as he was at the end, but as the man who sat hunched over the kitchen table under the warm glow of the desk lamp, meticulously sorting through household bills. She remembered his soft, tired smile, and the way he'd obsessively align every receipt. Maggie pressed her palm flat against the rough, lichen-spotted stone, trying to summon the warmth of his old cashmere sweater, the scent of cedar and peppermint that always clung to him. They had built a life on the bedrock of small-town integrity, or so she had told herself during those quiet evenings in their old house on the outskirts. A violent, metallic screech from the back room tore through the diner's silence, causing Maggie to jump. The porcelain cup she'd been holding slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor in a spray of white shards and dregs of coffee. A heartbeat later, a muffled thump vibrated through the floorboards. From beneath the kitchen door, a thin, dark ribbon of oily water began to snake across the linoleum. Maggie lunged for the door, bursting into the cramped utility space. A pipe had burst with predatory force. A jagged jet of water hammered against the low ceiling, shattering into a million icy needles that rained down on the stored dry goods. Within seconds, her leather boots were heavy and soaked. The floor vanished under a rising tide of gray sludge, carrying bobbing cardboard boxes and discarded menus like tiny shipwrecks. The deafening roar of the water swallowed her frustrated cry. She plunged her arms into the freezing, murky depths, fingers clawing frantically for the shut-off valve. But she found only the slick, slimy surface of the wall tiles and the unyielding cold of rusted iron. Desperation drove her to the tool chest. Maggie grabbed a heavy steel crowbar, the cold metal biting into her palms. She jammed the tip into the waterlogged wall paneling behind the supply rack and heaved. The sodden wood groaned and splintered, exposing a hidden layer of gray mold and a cloud of dry rot that billowed into her face, forcing a ragged cough from her throat. She tore away another strip of rotting plywood, and the crowbar struck something that didn't yield. It gave off a dull, solid ring, the sound of heavy metal. Maggie ripped the remaining fragments of the wall away, revealing a squat, steel door embedded directly into the ancient brickwork of the building's foundation. A thick coat of dust and grime clung to the gray surface, partially obscuring an old engraving of the Ashwood city seal. Her breath hitched. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch the cold, circular dial of the combination lock. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed to drown out the relentless spray of the broken pipe behind her. The heavy door of the safe yielded with a long, agonizing moan of ungreased hinges. A stale breath of air, scented with old paper, ink, and the damp chill of a cellar, brushed against Maggie's face. Inside, resting on the cold metal floor, sat a single ledger bound in dark, weathered leather. Its edges were frayed, the spine cracked from years of handling. Maggie pulled it out, her heart a lead weight in her chest. She flipped the pages, her eyes scanning the tight, cramped script she knew better than her own. This wasn't the neat, transparent accounting James had presented to the city council. These pages were a chaotic map of cryptic abbreviations and double entries. Columns of black ink were shadowed by frantic red slashes. Dates associated with the New Horizon project were underscored with heavy, aggressive lines, flanked by strange symbols that looked more like a private code than bookkeeping. She ran a shaking finger over a line where a figure with too many zeros sat next to a shell company she'd never heard of. A cold, nauseating lump formed in her throat as the logic of the numbers began to unravel the man she thought she knew. She clutched the leather book to her chest, the weight of it feeling like a stone as she stepped out into the bruised purple of the Ashwood twilight. The sudden, violent screech of tires on asphalt made her heart lurch. Maggie recoiled, her back slamming into the rough brick of the diner's exterior. A massive black SUV, its windows tinted to a deep, impenetrable obsidian, roared past, missing her knees by a mere inch. The wake of the vehicle hit her like a physical blow. A wave of freezing air and a spray of gray, slushy mud that coated her jeans. There were no license plates on the rear bumper. Through the dark glass, not even a silhouette of a driver was visible. The vehicle didn't slow down. It paused for a fraction of a second at the intersection, the engine growling like a cornered animal, before it lunged forward and vanished into the darkness of the side alley. Maggie stood frozen, a fine tremor shaking her shoulders, her fingers digging so deeply into the leather cover of the ledger that her nails left permanent indents. Maggie bolted through the front door of her ranch-style house, slamming the heavy oak frame shut behind her. She twisted the deadbolt 3 times, the sharp, metallic click providing a fleeting, hollow sense of security. Moving with a frantic, jerky energy, she paced through every room, yanking the heavy drapes shut and shoving the window latches home until they bit. The silence of the house was absolute, making the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sound like a hammer against an anvil. A countdown she didn't want to finish. She finally collapsed onto the hardwood floor of the hallway, not even bothering to shed her coat. She sat there in the dark, straining to hear the world outside. The skeletal branches of the oaks scraped against the roof tiles with a sound like questing fingernails. Every settling floorboard, every moan of the wind in the eaves made her flinch. The black, lightless windows of that SUV remained burned into her retinas, a predatory shadow that had followed her from the diner to her very doorstep. The pool of light from the single desk lamp cut a sharp circle into the darkness of the living room, illuminating the ledger and the stacks of scratch paper Maggie had spread across the table. She worked with a grim, methodical focus, transcribing James's shorthand and cross-referencing the figures with the glossy, optimistic brochures of the New Horizon project. The pencil snapped in her hand when she spotted a recurring pattern in the encrypted columns. A cup of tea sat forgotten at her elbow, a cold, gray film forming on its surface. She squinted at the dates, her stomach churning as she realized that every major influx of public funds into the project was immediately followed by a series of leakages. Vast sums siphoned away through a network of ghost contractors. Her eyes burned from the strain of the low light, but she pushed on. The letters and symbols began to coalesce into a terrifyingly clear picture of a grand deception, a parasitic scheme hidden behind the noble rhetoric of urban renewal. Maggie spread the maps of the neighboring counties across the rug, the paper crinkling under her weight. Armed with a red marker, she began to circle the locations of ruined family farms and shuttered factories in the surrounding districts. The data from James's secret ledger fit these ruins with sickening precision. Every cent stolen from the neighboring budgets had flowed into the bottomless maw of Ashwood's New Horizon. She watched as the cold, hard numbers transformed into broken lives and hollowed-out towns. The project wasn't a construction plan. It was a massive industrial pump, draining the lifeblood from dying settlements to inflate Ashwood with a false, bloated prosperity. Maggie clenched her fists until her knuckles turned white, staring at the calculations. The cost of the grand new city hall matched, to the dollar, the debt that had finally crushed a 100-year-old dairy farm 3 towns over. The mathematics of it felt like a physical filth on her skin. Her fingers faltered as she reached the final pages of the ledger. There, in the back, James had maintained a meticulous list of names. It was a directory of the town's elite: the mayor, the sheriff, the local judge. Next to each name sat a staggering figure with the clinical notation: consultation fees. Maggie recognized the flamboyant, looping signature of the head of the building department next to a number that exceeded his annual salary tenfold. The list was a map of the rot, a web of kickbacks that entangled every pillar of Ashwood society. She saw dates for clandestine meetings at private clubs and strings of offshore account numbers recorded with a terrifying, bureaucratic pedantry. The faces of the respectable citizens who had smiled at her at Sunday markets and offered their condolences at the funeral now seemed like grotesque masks. Their greed and betrayal were no longer whispers. They were documented facts in a small leather book. Near the bottom of a page, Maggie found a personal note in the margin, written in James's familiar, elegant slant: "To secure our future." The short phrase read, tucked beside a record of a particularly egregious illegal transfer. The words hit her like a physical blow to the solar plexus, knocking the wind from her lungs. The image of the honest, hard-working treasurer disintegrated into ash. All those years of comfort, the new roof, the kitchen renovation, the expensive jewelry he'd surprised her with on their 20th anniversary, had been purchased with the currency of lies and theft. She remembered the way he'd frequently avoid her gaze when she asked about his late nights at the office, the way he'd kept his study door locked even when he wasn't inside. The realization that the man she loved wasn't a victim of the system, but its primary architect, radiated through her chest as a sharp, agonizing throb. She climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to the attic, her footsteps light to avoid the groans of the old wood. Reaching the furthest corner under the eaves, she found a spot behind a stack of dusty crates filled with old baby clothes. There was a small, natural niche behind a support beam. Maggie wrapped James's book in a heavy layer of waterproof plastic, her movements slow and deliberate. She slid the bundle deep into the dark recess, then scattered a handful of gray attic dust over the opening to mask her work. This ledger was now her only shield, yet she knew it was also her death warrant. She descended the stairs, her face a mask of exhaustion, and began to systematically click off every light in the house until she was submerged in the shadows. The heavy oak door of the Ashwood police station swung open with a groan, releasing a thick, stale cloud of old leather, floor wax, and gun oil. Inside, a flickering fluorescent tube hummed with a nervous energy, casting a sickly, flickering light over the linoleum floor. Maggie approached the high wooden desk, catching the weary, disinterested gaze of the duty sergeant. A moment later, Tom Wilder emerged from his office, his heavy leather duty belt creaking as he adjusted the holster on his hip. Maggie felt her palms turn slick. Tom's hand landed on her shoulder, a gesture that used to feel protective, but now felt like a restraint. He led her down the narrow corridor, the rhythmic squeak of his polished boots echoing off the cinder block walls. Maggie spoke in a frantic, low whisper, pleading for a private word, her heart aching for the support of the man who had stood as godfather to her only child. The moment the words "secret ledger" left her lips, the friendly creases around Tom Wilder's eyes vanished. His face flattened into an impenetrable mask of cold stone. He straightened his spine with a suddenness that made his swivel chair emit a sharp, metallic protest. His palm came down on the desk with a thunderous crack that made the pens in the holder rattle. The air in the small office seemed to thicken, heavy with the scent of cold tobacco and an unspoken threat. Tom leaned forward, invading her personal space until Maggie could see the intricate web of broken capillaries in his eyes. His voice, stripped of its usual warmth, dropped to a gravelly rasp. He didn't ask. He commanded her to bring him the original book immediately. His thick fingers began a rhythmic, agitated drumming on an empty case file, the sound like a ticking bomb. Maggie stumbled out onto the sun-drenched parking lot, her car keys biting into her palm. She stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. Her blue pickup truck was rocking on its suspension. From the driver's side came the harsh, rhythmic sound of tearing fabric. Tom Wilder was bent double inside the cab, his large frame crammed into the small space. He was ruthlessly hauling the contents of the glove box out and tossing them onto the asphalt. Old gas receipts, a pair of scratched sunglasses, and a tattered road atlas scattered in the wind. Maggie watched, paralyzed, as he shoved his arm deep under the bench seat, his fingers clawing through the springs and foam of the upholstery. His face was a dark, angry purple, and his uniform shirt was mapped with sweat. When he finally straightened up and saw her standing there, he didn't offer a word of explanation. He simply spat a glob of tobacco juice onto the gray concrete and shoved past her. The interior of Ashwood's First Methodist Church was cool and smelled of beeswax and ancient wood. But the sanctuary offered Maggie no peace. She found Pastor Green in his small, wood-paneled office, hunched over a massive oak desk. A stack of hymnals sat to one side, but Maggie's eyes were drawn to the open appointment book in front of him. She froze in the doorway. Across the pages, in the pastor's neat, looping script, were columns of figures that looked hauntingly familiar. Specific dates were circled in red ink, dates that aligned perfectly with the clandestine transactions she had seen in James's ledger. Beside a 6-digit figure, she saw the initials NH scrawled in the margin. Green's hand moved with practiced speed to cover the page, but it was too late. The soft rustle of the paper in the church's profound silence sounded like a landslide in Maggie's ears. Pastor Green rose slowly, his long black cassock whispering against the carpet with a sound like a snake moving through dry grass. He crossed the room and took Maggie by the elbow. His grip was shocking, not the gentle touch of a clergyman, but a cold, iron-like squeeze that brooked no resistance. He leaned in close, his breath a sickly sweet mix of peppermint lozenges and old, stagnant fear. He began to speak of communal harmony and the burden of leadership. His voice, trained for the pulpit, vibrated with a soft, melodic threat as he characterized James's papers as a diabolical temptation that could set the entire town ablaze. Maggie recoiled toward the door, feeling the heavy timbered walls and the gilded icons of the saints closing in on her, silently demanding she sacrifice the truth for the sake of a comfortable lie. Maggie stood paralyzed in front of the diner, staring at the glittering sea of diamonds scattered across the sidewalk. The massive panoramic window she had scrubbed to a shine that morning was gone, replaced by a jagged, gaping maw of broken glass. Inside, a cold, mocking draft swirled through the room, snapping the plastic-covered menus on the tables. On the pristine surface of the bar, right in the center of the damp circle where her cleaning rag had rested, sat a heavy, soot-stained brick. It pinned a scrap of cheap, yellowed paper to the wood. Maggie reached out with a trembling hand and read the single word scrawled in thick, black marker: silence. The familiar scent of bleach and grilled onions was now choked out by the smell of wet pavement and street dust. Beneath her boots, the shards of her livelihood gave a sharp, crystalline crunch. The mayor of Ashwood stepped out from the shadow of a pillar, blocking Maggie's path across the town square. His expensive camel hair coat was a sharp, arrogant contrast to the gray work clothes of the men setting up for the festival. He didn't bother with a politician's smile. He reached out and snagged Maggie's wrist, his heavy gold cufflinks digging painfully into her skin. He leaned in, his voice a low, venomous hiss. He spoke of the unpaid mortgages on her home and how a clerical error could lead the insurance company to deny her claim after a tragic, accidental fire. Maggie looked into his eyes and saw the cold, predatory calculation of a man who viewed people as obstacles to be cleared. He was ready to incinerate James's memory and Maggie's future to protect the gleaming facade of their shared empire. Under the harsh, flickering light of her kitchen lamp, Maggie opened the ledger again, this time with a magnifying glass in hand. She began to peer between the lines of James's cramped script. There, nearly invisible to the naked eye, were tiny dots and dashes made with a colorless stylus. Marks that only became apparent when the light hit the page at a certain angle. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. James hadn't just been recording the crimes of others. He had been the one designing the logistics for moving the cash through a maze of fraudulent construction bids. Every scheme in the book bore his signature style, a terrifying, clinical precision. Maggie dropped the magnifying glass, the lens clattering against the table. Her husband hadn't been a bookkeeper for the mob. He had been the architect, the one who turned Ashwood into a private trough for the elite. As she pulled out of her driveway, a pair of high-intensity headlights flared in her rearview mirror. The black and white patrol sedan of the Ashwood Police Department sat 10 yards behind her, a silent, predatory shadow. It mirrored her every turn, staying at a fixed, haunting distance. When Maggie slowed for a stop sign, the cruiser slowed. When she accelerated, it followed suit. In the mirror, she could see the silhouette of the officer behind the wheel, his gaze fixed on her through the glass. The red and blue lights on the roof remained dark, but the silent escort felt more oppressive than a siren's wail. No matter which street she took, the heavy weight of the law sat on her bumper, a constant reminder that she was being herded. With shaking fingers, Maggie dialed her sister's number, desperate for the sound of a friendly voice. The phone rang once, twice. Then the line was cut by a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks, like the ticking of a metronome. Maggie froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed the receiver to her ear so hard the plastic groaned. In the background of the connection, she heard the faint, hollow sound of a third person's breathing and the distinct, high-pitched static of recording equipment. She didn't say a word. She slowly, carefully lowered the receiver back onto the cradle. The invisible web of surveillance had finally tightened around her home, turning every attempt at connection into a trap set by people she had once called friends. Maggie walked into the local grocery store, and the usual hum of neighborhood gossip died instantly. The silence was heavy and physical. Old Mrs. Gates, who had brought Maggie casseroles after the funeral, abruptly yanked her shopping cart around and vanished into the cereal aisle, her head down. Men who had been regulars at the diner for a decade suddenly found something fascinating to study on the labels of soup cans. The air around Maggie seemed to chill. People stepped back as she moved down the aisle, creating a wide, empty radius as if she were carrying a plague. She saw the look in their eyes. It wasn't hatred, but a paralyzing, wide-eyed fear of being seen with her. The isolation cut deeper than any open threat, a silent exile from the only world she knew. The front door of the diner gave a pathetic, high-pitched screech as Maggie pushed it open. It hung by a single, twisted hinge, dragging across the floor. Inside, the air was thick with a choking fog of pulverized drywall, through which the morning sun cut harsh, dusty paths. The once cozy leather booths had been flayed. Yellow foam innards spilled out of long, jagged slashes like the guts of slaughtered animals. The heavy oak tables she had polished every morning were now piles of kindling, deep axe wounds white and raw against the dark wood. The commercial stove had been wrenched from the wall at an impossible angle, the copper gas lines hissing like angry snakes. On the floor, amidst a sea of shattered plates and spilled milk, lay the torn-out wiring of the espresso machine, still sparking fitfully in the puddles. A spray of crystalline shards erupted into the room as Tom Wilder's deputies kicked in the remaining fragments of the panoramic window. Two men in heavy camouflage jackets vaulted inside, their boots thudding onto the linoleum. They drove heavy steel pry bars into the seams of the floorboards, the wood screaming as it was wrenched upward. Dust and splinters billowed into the air, clogging Maggie's throat and making her eyes sting. One of the men lunged forward, snagging the collar of her denim jacket and shaking her until her teeth rattled. He shoved his face close to hers, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee, and screamed for the location of the ledger. Behind him, the other deputy kicked over the heavy stainless steel reach-in refrigerator, the crash echoing like a gunshot in the ruined space. Maggie's fingers brushed against the cold, heavy handle of a cast-iron skillet that had been knocked onto the floor. With a short, desperate swing, she brought the heavy metal down onto the temple of the deputy holding her. There was a sickening, wet thud, and the man crumpled onto a pile of broken brick, his crowbar clattering away. Maggie didn't wait. She scrambled toward the narrow, rectangular window of the pass-through station. She shoved herself into the tight space, the jagged aluminum frame tearing through her sweater and dragging across the skin of her ribs. She tumbled out the other side, her hands slapping into the cold, oily muck of the back alley. The smell of rotting cabbage and rusted metal filled her nose as she scrambled to her feet and vanished into the gray morning mist. She burst out of the alley and into the surging, colorful tide of the Harvest Festival. The main street of Ashwood was a roar of sound and movement. Grotesque papier-mâché boar masks and towering straw effigies bobbed above the heads of the crowd. The thick, cloying scents of grilled sausages and spun sugar threatened to choke her as she fought her way through the ranks of townspeople in their heavy autumn coats. The rhythmic thrum of the parade drums vibrated in her chest, masking the distant shouts of the men behind her. Maggie ducked her head, trying to vanish among the revelers whose painted faces blurred into a dizzying, nightmarish mask. Sweat stung her eyes, and her heart felt like a frantic, trapped bird as she dove between the rows of white-topped vending stalls. A massive, dark shape detached itself from the shadows of the town hall, cutting off her path. Pastor Green stood there, his long black coat making him look like a predatory bird. He lunged forward, his dry, skeletal fingers locking onto Maggie's shoulders with a strength that belied his age. He smelled of old beeswax and peppermint. He stood with his legs braced, blocking the narrow gap between two stone pillars. His face was a mask of fanatical, twitching rage. He hissed at her, his words a stream of venom about eternal damnation and the sanctity of the town's peace. He demanded she return James's papers to purify her soul. Flecks of spittle hit Maggie's cheek as he tried to drag her deeper into the shadows of the colonnade. Maggie twisted her body with a violent wrench, slipping out of the pastor's grasp like a knot untying. She dove into the darkness beneath the temporary wooden bleachers. The air here was cool and smelled of damp earth and fresh pine shavings. She crawled on her belly through the sawdust, her hands dodging the thick coils of black electrical cables and the rusted iron supports of the stands. Above her, the thunder of 1,000 feet made the planks groan and flex. She froze, pressing her face into the cold dirt as a pair of polished black uniform boots stopped just inches from her head. She watched through the gaps in the wood as the shadows of the deputies moved slowly, the sharp, metallic click of their radios sounding like a death knell in the cramped space. Through the gaps in the unplaned lumber of the stage, Maggie could see the underside of the main platform. The mayor of Ashwood was pacing directly above her, the rhythmic clack of his expensive leather shoes echoing in the hollow space. Beside him stood the polished, mirror-like loafers of the investor from the city. On a table draped in heavy red velvet sat the thick, gold-embossed folders of the New Horizon contract. Maggie heard the amplified, booming voice of the mayor as he spoke into the microphone, his tone full of a practiced, oily optimism. The roar of the crowd's applause sounded like a landslide to Maggie as she watched the investor reach into his breast pocket and pull out a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen, poised to finalize the theft of a county. Maggie shifted her gaze to a dented galvanized trash bin sitting in the shadows near the back of the stage. That was where she had shoved the plastic-wrapped ledger under the cover of the morning fog. She began to pull herself forward, her fingernails clawing at the hard-packed dirt. Sharp splinters from the low-hanging joists snagged her hair and tore at the back of her jacket. Every booming step of the orator above sent a jolt through her spine. She ignored the burning ache in her knees and the raw skin on her elbows, her eyes locked on the dull, metallic sheen of the bin. It was the only thing that stood between her and the evidence that would either save her or bury her. A rotted floor joist snapped with a sharp crack under Maggie's weight as she tried to pull herself out from under the stage. The sound was like a pistol shot. Tom Wilder, standing guard at the edge of the VIP seating, spun around instantly. His hand moved with a fluid, terrifying speed to the holster at his hip. He vaulted over the railing, smashing through a decorative display of hay bales that exploded into a cloud of golden dust. He lunged toward her, his face a dark, mottled purple, his breath coming in ragged, angry gasps. Maggie saw him level his service weapon at her. She scrambled toward the trash bin, her boots slipping on the loose straw, as the sheriff of Ashwood closed the distance in 3 powerful, predatory strides. Tom Wilder slammed Maggie against the rough brick wall behind the stage, the impact driving the air from her lungs in a sharp wheeze. The cold, unyielding muzzle of his Glock pressed hard into her ribs. He was breathing heavily into her ear, the scent of stale coffee and gun oil rolling off him in waves. His free hand began a brutal, frantic search of her person, ripping her canvas bag from her shoulder and dumping its meager contents onto the dirt. He hissed through clenched teeth, his voice a low, terrifying vibration, demanding the book. His finger was tight and steady on the trigger. Maggie felt the abrasive brick tearing at her shoulder blades, the barrel of the gun a freezing point of pressure through her jacket, while Wilder realized the bag was empty. Maggie snapped her head up, her eyes locking onto Wilder's. His pupils were blown wide, his irises ringed with the red fire of broken capillaries. On the stage above them, the mayor began the long, dramatic flourish of removing the cap from his pen. Maggie watched the investor's hand move toward the parchment that would sign away the lives of her neighbors. The movement seemed to happen in slow motion, a nightmare unfolding in the bright autumn sun. She knew that once that ink hit the paper, James's truth would become nothing more than a ghost story. A cold, hard rage began to burn away the last of her fear. The sudden, blaring roar of the ceremonial trumpets and the rapid-fire roll of the parade drums made Tom Wilder flinch, his head snapping toward the cheering crowd for a fraction of a second. Maggie seized the opening. She dropped her weight, ducking under his arm and plunging her hand into the greasy, freezing muck inside the galvanized bin. Her fingers closed around the familiar, rough texture of the plastic-wrapped bundle hidden beneath the wet cardboard. She yanked the ledger out, clutching it to her chest as a swarm of startled flies erupted from the trash. She could feel the icy runoff from the discarded cups soaking into her sleeve, but her grip was like iron. Wilder spun back, his face contorting with rage as he reached for her. But Maggie was already lunging out of the shadows and toward the stage stairs. She dodged under Wilder's outstretched arm, his fingers grazing the fabric of her coat but failing to find a hold. She scrambled up the raw wooden steps of the platform, her boots drumming a frantic rhythm against the lumber. The blinding glare of the stage lights hit her full in the face, turning the thousands of faces in the square into a shifting, indistinct sea of shadows. The air here was hot and smelled of ozone and the mayor's expensive cologne. Maggie burst into the center of the stage, squinting against the brilliance that reflected off the long line of television cameras aimed at the podium. She came to a halt in the center of the spotlight, her chest heaving as a sudden, expectant silence fell over the square, cutting the music short. Maggie stepped forward, her shoulder bumping the stunned mayor aside as she took the microphone. A sharp, piercing squeal of feedback tore through the air, making the people in the front rows wince. She raised her right arm high, thrusting James's battered leather ledger into the air for everyone to see. The small red light on the nearest news camera flared to life, capturing her image and broadcasting it across the state. She felt the leather warming under the afternoon sun, the book a heavy, solid weight that drew every eye on the square. Her voice, amplified by the massive speakers, rolled over the crowd in a steady, unbreakable wave, calling for the town to finally listen. She pulled the ledger close to the camera lens, showing the frayed spine and the official city seal. With a sharp, practiced motion, she picked at a hidden seam in the leather cover, and 2 slim silver flash drives tumbled out, dangling from thin metal chains. Maggie turned her gaze to the mayor, whose face had turned a sickly, ashen gray beneath his stage makeup. She spoke with a cold, clinical clarity, identifying the drives as James's insurance policy. Digital duplicates containing every illegal signature and every hidden wire transfer. The mayor's hand twitched, a useless, reflexive gesture to stop the unstoppable. But Maggie only gripped the drives tighter, their cold steel a sharp contrast to the heat of the stage. Maggie squared her shoulders and looked directly into the black eye of the lens, knowing her image was now in every living room in the county. She announced that the digital copies of everything in the ledger had already been uploaded to a secure server and sent to the state prosecutor and the FBI. A low, rolling murmur started in the back of the crowd, growing into a sound like a gathering storm. She watched the camera crews begin to scramble, their headsets buzzing with frantic instructions from their producers. Every word she spoke was now a permanent part of the public record. The invisible, suffocating threads that had bound her for the last week finally snapped, replaced by the crushing weight of the truth she had unleashed. The mayor of Ashwood stood frozen, his hand still poised above the contract. The gold nib of his pen touched the paper, leaving a heavy, spreading blot of black ink that looked like a spreading stain. He looked around like a trapped animal, seeing only the wall of lenses and the rhythmic flash of cameras that sounded like the snapping of a trap. Maggie stood a foot away from him, as steady as a mountain. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His silk tie seemed to be choking him, and he clawed at his collar. Under the relentless gaze of the media, he didn't dare lay a finger on her. Transformed in an instant from the town's master to a hollowed-out ghost, Tom Wilder slowly lowered his weapon, the black steel of the Glock disappearing behind his thigh. He looked at Maggie, and the predatory fire in his eyes had been replaced by the dull, flat realization of total defeat. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, trying to fade into the heavy velvet shadows of the stage curtains. Maggie heard his heavy boots retreat across the wooden planks, the sound masked by the growing roar of the crowd. He vanished into the darkness of the wings, leaving behind only the fading scent of gun oil and failure. His power, built on intimidation and the badge, had evaporated in the light of the cameras, and Maggie watched him go with a single, sharp nod of her head. Maggie opened the ledger to a page marked with heavy red slashes and began to read. Her voice was flat and unwavering as she read the name of the local judge and the exact amount of the bribe he'd taken for the New Horizon permits. The crowd let out a collective gasp that turned into a snarl. When she read the second name, the head of the Public Works Department, a forest of angry, handwritten protest signs rose into the air. The third name was drowned out by a wave of booing and shouting. People began to surge toward the stage, their faces twisted with a raw, righteous fury. Maggie watched the polished facade of the town crumble, exposing the rotted structure James had documented with such agonizing, bureaucratic detail. The mayor and the investor didn't wait for her to finish. They turned and bolted for the rear exit of the stage. The investor dropped his gold pen, and it skittered across the boards with a hollow ring, disappearing into a crack. They ran with their heads down, shielding their faces with their coats as the crowd began to pelt them with empty plastic cups and half-eaten apples. The unsigned contract lay abandoned on the podium, its pages snapping in the wind like the wings of a dying bird. Maggie watched as the investor's botched signature, a meaningless, jagged line, was left behind. The square erupted in whistles and jeers as the two men dove into the back of a waiting black sedan and sped away. Three men in sharp, charcoal gray overcoats moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Maggie watched from the stage as they intercepted Tom Wilder at the base of the rear stairs. One of the state agents spun the sheriff around, his movements a blur of professional violence, and the sharp, double click of steel handcuffs echoed in the sudden hush of the immediate area. Wilder didn't fight back. His head hung low, his silver badge glinting one last time in the dying sun. They led him away through the maze of festival equipment and discarded crates. Maggie stood at the edge of the stage, the cold autumn wind pulling at her hair, feeling the immense weight finally lift from her shoulders, replaced by a crystalline, hollow peace. A week later, Maggie O'Connell stood in the doorway of her diner, leaning against the frame. Inside, the air was clean, smelling of fresh white paint and industrial floor wax, but the booths remained empty. A heavy flatbed truck rumbled past on the street, its back piled high with the torn and dirty New Horizon banners. Maggie watched the men in orange vests as they systematically dismantled the skeleton of the festival stage. The wind chased a tattered newspaper across the asphalt, its headline screaming about the wave of indictments at City Hall. She looked at the empty spaces where the politicians' faces used to hang and felt the last traces of the town's old, suffocating lies dissolve into the crisp, clear air.